Today I want to take the adventure into a different direction. Um, Most of the other ones I've been doing have been kind of just about me and just about, well, about me. So, what I'd like to do is I'd like to focus on somebody who's not me, who happens to be my grandfather. My grandfather was one of those quirky characters who every day after school, um, I would ride my bike home, and a block away from where I lived was where my grandfather lived. He lived there because he was getting old in life, and it was a better place where the grandkids could kind of reach out to him and find out if everything was okay and that sort of thing. So anyway, I used to ride by his apartment all the time, knock on the door, come in, and he was just a really interesting person to talk to. He had done a lot of things in his life. Um, Unfortunately, he had some alcohol problems when he was in his mid 30s and 40s, and they kind of never really got corrected. He was still drinking into his 60s, but his stories were just fascinating. And one thing about him that most people would never know just from looking at him was he was a brilliant musician. His favorite weapon of choice was the mandolin, and he used to play it constantly. He'd play famous songs, he'd create songs, he'd just sit there and pick at it and have so much fun with it. And anyway, so because there was this huge line of musicians in the family. Unfortunately, it skipped my mother's generation, but I was required to take a musical instrument when I was in grade school, and so I wanted to play the drums, but unfortunately, you don't really get a choice when you're living in that sort of environment. So they handed me a violin in the case and said, "This is the weapon that you're going to learn." And so I spent 4 or 5 years playing the violin. Was never a fan of it, but it helped me learn, strings and musical theory, which was pretty helpful, you know, for a young kid at that age. Anyway, so one interesting story was I brought my violin home with me one day. I mean, I brought it home every day, but I happened to have it with me when I rode by to go visit my grandfather. And my grandfather looked at the case and he was like, "What's the instrument?" And because it could have been anything, could have been a machine gun for all we knew. So anyway, he opened the case, took a look at the instrument, got the distinct impression he had never played it before. So he picked it up, played along with the strings a little bit, then took a look at the bow, kind of examined it, played it across the screens a couple of times, and I kind of wasn't paying any further attention to it because I went into the kitchen to make myself a sandwich or something like that. And when I came back in, he was playing a song on the violin, and I watched him continue to play with it and fiddle with it, and well, fiddle's kind of a good word for that. And by the time, I had finished my sandwich, it was like a virtuoso playing on this thing. Like he had been playing it all of his life. And that's the kind of musician he was. He could just pick up something and just start playing it. Well, he used to play at the Senior Citizen Center, which was on the cliff overlooking Santa Monica Beach. This was in Santa Monica, obviously, at the time. And there were park benches there, so he would constantly play on the park benches. And unlike other people who would be playing on the park benches, he never put out his guitar case or his mandolin case, like other ones did, so people would throw money into it. And people kept coming by, looking for where were they supposed to donate, and he was having nothing of that. He just wanted to play music, and he wanted an audience to play music too. So anyway, he was also a very, let's just say, a virtuoso of telling stories. And my mother never believed a single story he ever told her, which was kind of interesting. One day we were watching television and the movie The Sting came on. Now, I don't know if you know much about the movie The Sting, but it stars Robert Redford and Paul Newman. Anyway, Paul Newman is on the screen, and my grandfather like points at the screen and goes, "I had lunch with him." And my mother like looks at him and goes, "Right, Dad," as she answered him almost all the time whenever he had a story. And so he said, "No, I did." And she was just like, "Whatever, Dad," and continued watching the show, and we all watched the movie until it was done. Anyway, didn't think anything of it. But years and years later, I was in San Francisco, and usually before I got onto the BART train to go home at the Powell station, I would always wander into, I think it was called Powell Books, which was right off of the station, like right up above the station. And so they had tons and tons of books. But in the front of it, they had this section where they had, all sorts of movie books, books about movies and anything that was artsy that was like in this huge stand. And they were usually selling them for, half off or whatever it was, because they'd already done their run and nobody had actually bought them. So it was just kind of like that. So anyway, I had some time before my train was going to leave, so I was just fingering through one of the books, and it was something about Hollywood stories or Hollywood background stories and all that. And I was flipping through it, and there was a scene from the making of the movie The Sting. Now, in case you don't know it, The Sting was mostly filmed in Santa Monica, at the Santa Monica Pier. Like the big carousel that you see in the movie, that's actually the carousel that's actually at on Santa Monica Pier. Anyway, so right outside that is where they had the little not picnic tables, but the round tables, with the seats, the kind they bring in for like whenever a movie is being made, and place for the stars and the staff to sit. So anyway, in this book, there's a picture of Robert Redford, Paul Newman, and my grandfather sitting at a table where my grandfather's actually playing his mandolin. Now tell me that didn't prove his point that he was trying to tell a long time ago. Unfortunately, at this time, both he and my mother had passed away, so there's no way I could bring this book to my mom and say, "He was there. He did have lunch with them or breakfast with them." So that never kind of got to happen. I found out, so at least I knew, but it didn't go any further than that. There was another story he used to tell all the time, and it was because he was Ukrainian, and he had moved over into Western Europe at a certain point, and that's when World War II took place. And his stories that he used to tell, at least he used to tell to my mom, were that he was an ambulance driver, and that's about all he would ever say. And so when I was talking to him personally, because I at one point started writing down some of his life story because I found it fascinating. Unfortunately, I don't have any more copies of what I wrote down, so I just kind of have to go off of memory now. But he had said at some point he fought for the French resistance, which, okay, he was Ukrainian, didn't really make a whole lot of sense. But at this time I was young and I hadn't found out that the other story was true. So years later, I'm doing research for a project that I was doing, and I started going through some old records of basically the French Resistance, and it had a listing of a whole bunch of people who were members of the French Resistance, and there it was, my grandfather's name. Didn't say what he did, but it just said he was one of the members of the French Resistance, and I just kind of thought, wow, and nobody will ever know unless you're watching this video now. Anyway, my grandfather had tons and tons of stories. Most of them have been proven to be true, at least by me. But unfortunately, the people he originally told him to, like my mother, who I think he was always trying to, like, fascinate and tell her like what a life he actually had, he never got her to believe, because throughout years she thought that, basically these were just drunk stories, and he wasn't drunk when he was telling these stories. So that's my grandfather. His name was Alex Romanuk. Um, Nobody will ever know anything about him other than what I'm telling now. But I thought, maybe it's time for me to actually tell people some of the things he did. He was a fascinating musician. He used to play this one song all the time, which was from Chopin. Chopin. I never figured out how to say his name. Um, I don't remember the name of it, but it's kind of a soliloquy kind of a song. And he would make up um, lyrics to it, which, the, you know, a piano player doesn't usually create, lyrics to his music. But he had all sorts of lyrics to the song, and he used to call it the baloney song. And let's just say that it was a song that every time I hear the original, the piano version of the musician who created, the music, I always think of the baloney song, because his lyrics constantly fill my head whenever I hear that song. And I guess that's good, because he left a memory, and sometimes that's all you can do.